New research has revealed that Victoria has become poorer than all other states and territories except South Australia after years of weak household incomes, deteriorating economic growth per person and poor productivity. Saul Eslake is an economist and the author of the research. Saul, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on your show here.
No worries. State Treasurer Tim Pallas is going to say that you're wrong, but you've got no doubt that you're right.
Well, I'm going on figures published by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, so if Mr. Pallas wants to say they're wrong, he can take that up with Dr. David Gruen, who's the head of the Stats Bureau. Let me say two things about this first up. It's not meant to be anti-Victoria, as some people will portray it. I think, as you know, I lived in Melbourne for 32 years, loved it. Victoria's my second favourite state, if people will forgive me for loving my own state of Tasmania, where I now live. I just wish we could have a footy team of our own, but that's another issue.
Well, part of your study says that Victoria is poorer than Tasmania.
Well, on one measure, surprisingly, it is. And I must admit, I was so surprised by that I triple-checked that I was reading the figures correctly. And that appears to be true in terms of household disposable income as the Stats Bureau measures it. The other thing I want to say is that this is not a partisan political thing. I was at pains to say in the Fin Review that Victoria benefited from competent state government under both Liberal Premier Jeff Kennett and Labor Premiers Steve Bracks and John Brumby, and that the deterioration in Victoria's economic performance began under the previous Liberal government and wasn't solely the responsibility of the present government. So I'm absolutely not trying to make any political points or do the state opposition's job for it. But the reality seems to be that although on the surface Victoria has had strong economic growth over the last 10 years, faster slightly than the national average. That has increasingly relied on population growth. People moving to Victoria both from other parts of Australia, which they've consistently done over the last 25 years, and increasingly people moving to Victoria from overseas. So in the 3 years prior to the onset of COVID, Victoria was getting almost a third of Australia's national migrant intake, despite only having a quarter of the nation's population. Now, that does speak to the attraction of Victoria as a place to live and to find work and raise a family and all that sort of thing. But when you abstract from the impact of population growth in order to ask how are ordinary Victorians' living standards faring, what you find is that excluding the impact of population growth, Victoria's economic growth has been half the national average over the last decade, or to put the same thing in a slightly different way, whereas at the turn of the century, when Steve Bracks was the Premier of Victoria, Victoria's per capita gross product, that's a measure of the value of goods and services produced in Victoria per head of population, was about 1% more than the national average, but in 2019-20 it was almost 10% below the national average.
So Saul, generally speaking, do you think we have a positive pro-business narrative in our economy?
Less so now than was the case under Jeff Kennett and Steve Bracks and John Brumby as premiers. Less so now, less so than in New South Wales. Not necessarily less so than in some other states and territories, but bearing in mind that Victoria is always in competition with New South Wales for investment and jobs, the two states have flipped over. In the 1990s and the first year of the 20th century, Victoria clearly had a more pro-business culture than New South Wales, without sacrificing any of the progressive social policies that have made Melbourne a nicer place to live in than Sydney. But over the last 10 years, I think that has flipped over. And unfortunately, the measures in the most recent Victorian budget, we haven't seen the New South Wales budget yet, of course, but Victoria has a much bigger fiscal problem to deal with than New South Wales does.